Happy Valentine's Day. I'm taking a few minutes before watching a movie with my beloved to chat with all of you about some things that I've been thinking about because I have been thinking about a lot of shit. One of the things that I'm very curious about is like whether we are repeating history or whether we are evolving history, right? So there, I think, are numerous ways in which like people sort of come at this. I think you probably have heard from other folks like this idea that like there's sort of like every 80 years or so there's this major upheaval, right? Like the distance between the Civil War and World War II, for example, is that 80-year arc, and sort of you sort of begin to calibrate things on this 80 some odd year reboot of everything where there's this major event that causes things to become realigned, and that otherwise what you are doing is essentially tweaking around the margins for things before and after those big adjustments. There are other people that have argued that history is not to be understood in that way. It's not cyclical, but it's actually this thing that is evolving as we are evolving. And the sort of like the pop culture reference I have for this is, I don't know if you guys have seen the Third Body Problem on Netflix, I believe is what it's called. I have not read the novels. I've only seen the Netflix series, so forgive me for not being prepared to fully engage in this pop culture reference, but my pop culture reference is this, that essentially the premise of this sci-fi series is that the extraterrestrials that need a place to live are coming to Earth, but travel through space takes a long while, and it's going to take them like 400 years to get to Earth, and they are afraid that by the time they get to Earth we will have surpassed them and can therefore defeat them, and so they work to sabotage our ability to improve our lives. And like the thing that they've noted is that it took us a long time to go from early human organization to the wheel, and then things began to jump and accelerate, from fire to the Industrial Revolution, to having the ability to land someone on the moon, to having phones in our pockets that have computers so incredibly sophisticated that they can run, artificial intelligence programs such as they are, and compute things at ways that were far more sophisticated when we landed on the moon in 1969. So anyway, the idea here is that we're either in a cycle of history or we're in a way in which history is leapfrogging in front of itself, and we are sort of lost and running around rudderless right now because we don't have a place to orient ourselves from. That if we had a very clear place to orient ourselves from, we would know what to do. This is my point here. It's sort of like a long-winded way of getting to the point, but a lot of people who are currently feeling lost, like, oh shit, what do we do? Donald Trump, it's chaos, like the world makes no sense. They're talking about building resorts in Gaza, and like we're living in the upside down and everything is horrible. How you begin to try to make sense of it? Well, one, if you think that history is cyclical, it sort of provides you with some reassurance, because then you can go back into the crates and you can dig up the way that people have done shit before, and then you can feel really, really charged and reassured that like we're going to be okay. Because a century of abolitionists and a century of suffragists and a century's worth of people who have done all kinds of incredible things are there to give you this guidance, to give you this barometer, to give you this North Star of what to do, because, we've done it before. And then the folks on the other side, they're like, nope, this is not precedented. We don't have a historical reference point. History is sort of winding outside of control and everything is just chaos theory right now, or looking for some great grand way of like stringing together these ideas. So this is what I've been thinking about, right? Like one side and the other side, and what if, again, as is often the case, both things happen to be true. So what if a part of this that's happening right now, what if part of what we're dealing with is historical? And we can look at things like, oh my gosh, like the unraveling of the institutions of American government, and we can sort of have an orienting thought of like, okay, the last time that institutions were attacked, for example, when Andrew Jackson defied the Supreme Court and continued to perpetuate genocide against Native Americans, what was the response? How were people building power? How were they becoming resilient and overcoming that? What were the ways in which people were organizing when all hope seemed lost to them in the times in which they were living? Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad is a real thing. There are really people who helped provide safe houses and created routes for people to escape chattel slavery, and they risked their own lives and their own family, knowing that the institutions of this country were not there for them. They could not count on the power of the state or the power of the federal government to protect them. In fact, they knew the opposite was true. They knew that they would be endangered by doing those things in the face of that power, but they still organized. They still created an underground railroad that was an organized system of safe houses that got folks to freedom. So there's all of these great things that allow us to understand these great examples, this amazing stuff that is in our history, in our DNA, as a people, as a culture, right? And again, those of us who are immigrants can think of, like, within our own families, like folks who have survived things, right? You know, if you're Argentine, you're thinking about Las Madres de Mayo. If you're Mexican, you're thinking about the students that stood up in Tlatelolco and the ones that have stood up more recently on Ayotzinapa and other places, right? Like, you're thinking about all of these examples of folks who stood up, the Chileans who stood up to Pinochet, the Brazilians that came back from the military coup, the Central Americans who have survived endless civil war and found a way out of it. And those figures like Oscar Arias, who helped to negotiate peace. And, like, again, these are paths forward that are apparent to us and available to us to draw inspiration from. And then there's this wild card on the other side of, like, okay, well, what if this is really, truly unprecedented? And what if this really, truly is something that, like, there is no clear manual, this clear fix-it guide that we can point to? I invite us to, like, hold that tension in the sense that, like, somebody had to be the first, right? Somebody had to be the first. Somebody had to be the first, right? I mean, we just witnessed Kendrick Lamar do a show that was a real hip-hop show, right? Like, and, you know, again, what is the difference between what Kendrick Lamar did and when, you know, Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and 50 Cent did the halftime show, right? Like, you know, there's a very clear, yes, like, generational difference and commercial hip-hop difference versus folks that are respected, you know, by those who are in the artistry, by those who are in the culture, right? Like, there's sort of like a deeper level that is being achieved, a breakthrough that's happening. But the whole point is that, like, 50 years ago, there was no hip-hop, and then there was hip-hop, right? There was no punk rock, and then there was punk rock. There was no rock and roll, and then there was rock and roll. There was no jazz, and then there was jazz, right? So it doesn't matter what your reference point is or where your passion is. The simple fact is that, like, things have erupted out into the world where somebody had to be the first, and somebody had to be the founder, and some group of people had to be the ones that were giving birth to this change of thinking, of culture, of generation, of philosophy, of, like, knowing of what was possible, the way we were orienting ourselves, the things that we thought to be true, and the things that became real, right? So I think that there's a great opportunity in front of us to be the first, to do something that has not been done before. And perhaps that thing that has not been done before is to actually figure out how to have a decent society and have a functional government and have a world in which everyone has the opportunity to live with dignity, not on the basis of, like, the things that you can extract from them, how many hours a day they can work, how hard they have done XYZ, but simply because we have an understanding of, like, the sufficiency of our resources, the wealth of the world in which we live, and the knowledge that is possible for us to recapture. It's a lot bigger and more full of possibility to imagine that there are things that we could rediscover in this time that have previously been lost to us, than to think that we are only the product of a narrow history written by victors, and that all that's left is what is left, like we've been editing away, right? Because if history is just cyclical, then it is just a photocopy. It is just a mimeograph, right? We're just making copies of things, and eventually those copies stop being clear. Eventually, those copies stop having significance, right? But if we are adding to,